Before we describe this more about this search, you mount a very impressive case in the book about why Grizzinger, why you thought his story was worth telling. So would you explain to the audience a bit of your thinking about the trouble you went to?
Well, I think I was just so curious to, get away from this idea of only concentrating on the big beasts at the top of the Nazi regime. And I just found that, concentrating on somebody who, if anything, for want of a better expression, was more of an ordinary Nazi, somebody who perhaps didn't leave a real mark on history, yet boy, did he affect the lives of so many people, not just in his family, but people who he interacted with as a result of his work at the SS, as a result of his work at the Gestapo, and then later in Prague. So I was really interested in exploring what I would call these enablers, the people that allowed the machine to function. And without these people, it just wouldn't have worked. As historians, it's just amazing to think that somebody like this family, this German family, had absolutely no idea that Germany was going to lose the war. It came as the biggest shock to them. Germany was not invaded. So the end of the war was a crushing defeat for people like Grizzinger. And this is really, really important because Grizzinger was born between 1900 and 1910. And when we look at the biographies of the top Nazis, those who went into huge, very successful positions in the SS, the Gestapo, etc., they are all born between 1900 and 1910. This war youth generation, much too young to fight in the First World War, but boy, did the First World War mark them in a way which just changed and transformed the rest of their lives. It was the defeat of the war, the devastation, the poverty, the humiliation. This is something that a whole generation of German, especially young men, just could not get over. And that's what really pushed them in a direction that would later result in Nazism. So Grizzinger came from this very right-wing family, nationalist, Protestant, very pro-royalist. So for somebody like Grizzinger, given his background, and perhaps we'll talk about this in a moment, it wasn't the biggest leap in the world for him to end up supporting the Nazi Party. But he did it very, very late, because it's worth mentioning before that he went to Tübingen University, which was one of the most right-wing nationalist universities in Germany. No Jewish students, no Jewish faculty, totally banned. And the entire rhythm of life in 1920s Tübingen University was to remember the First World War, the humiliation, the disgusting Weimar Republic, the Jews, the communists who had so apparently brought Germany to defeat. And so it was at university, we see a picture here, he joined one of these very far-right fencing societies, which all the sort of the upper middle class aristocratic young men would join. So that's a picture from his group. And it was encouraged that the men would get a scar on their face, a schmiss. It was something that, a rite of passage for them to sort of show their masculinity. So Grizzinger on his first day would have, sort of encouraged his opponent to sort of, tear into his face, and then he would reach for some salt and put the salt in the wound in order to bring it out. And I think maybe we have a picture of Grizzinger later on when he's about to go to World War II, and we can sort of see perhaps the scar, but it's not important for now. But this is kind of, to give you an example, this is the environment in which he's growing up in. These are his friends, and these are the people that help him later when it comes to sort of joining the Nazi Party. As time went on, it just became so clear to me how devastating life would have been for them in the 1950s and 60s. Their mother remarried, had more children, so there was no photos up anywhere of their father at all. Nobody wanted to talk about their father. They tried so many times to ask questions, and then eventually I think they just stopped asking. It just got too painful for them. So the fact that I'm sort of rocking up 70 years later saying, oh, hello, I've got your father's documents that I found in an armchair. For them, it was just this extraordinary moment where I felt very privileged, actually, that as a historian, usually when I'm talking to people and I'm asking questions, I will just write every single thing down, and then maybe I'll have a cup of tea, and then I'll go, and that's the end of that. Whereas here, I would write everything down, and then we would stop, and then they would ask me a ton of questions. You know about my father. Tell me, what did you discover about this? What did you discover about that? Very curious reversal of roles there. It seemed to work very well. I think I needed them, and in some ways they needed me.
Jutta and Barbara, and also Jutta's daughter, who by the time you meet her is in her mid-50s, Astrid, they all have a tendency, an impulse to want to think the best of their father or grandfather. And especially in the case of the younger woman, Astrid, that surprised me a little. I would have thought that someone of her generation would have, through her schooling and so on, would have perhaps thought the worst, that, what did grandfather do in the war? But it was once again touching and painful, and a bit surprising. The Germans have a reputation for having very deeply processed the crimes of their nation during the war, and yet these people had this family pull to minimise what he may have been guilty of. Right.
But I think it's actually extremely common now when we look at the next generation. So not the sons and daughters, when we're looking at the grandchildren. Very common. There's so many new books coming out, saying grandpa wasn't a Nazi or something like that. It's very common that the younger children who didn't even know their grandparents or only knew them as very elderly and adorable, that they would try and defend the action. So this is something that's extremely common. So I wasn't terribly surprised by Astrid's reaction to her grandfather, whom she never knew. And I've had some amazing emails, absolutely extraordinary, from German people just writing to me saying, I've read your book. I can relate to this so much. There was somebody in my family who was just like him and we never spoke about it. And so that for me has just been totally extraordinary. And of course I write back each time. I'm not asking people to go through their armchairs or anything like that, but nevertheless, I'm always curious to know what kind of documents people have kept in their family.
Although something you wrote there did make me think about furniture. When you went around the rounds of the upholsterers in Prague, and they were saying, oh, we're coming across documents all the time that often communist era documents. And you would think, and that they throw them away. And I thought this was almost a plea to Czech historians, get out the furniture upholsterers.
You're absolutely right. I think the shock, the people in Amsterdam, the guy was so moved and angry by his discovery. It was something that had never happened to him before. Whereas in Prague, when I was interviewing chair makers there, because at first I wanted to write a history of the armchair, which I do in the book. But then I got more interested in Robert Grizzinger. But, I wanted to know everything about the chair. How much did it cost? Who was the intended buyer? Did it come from Germany? Did it come from Prague? Did it ever belong to a Jewish family? Things like this. So I would go around Prague interviewing all the old chair makers, trying to find out everything about this armchair. And, they were just never sort of fazed by the fact that documents were discovered inside. I was standing outside one furniture store one day, and this guy who was working, he just sort of took a puff on his cigarette and he was like, sir, this was communist Czechoslovakia, for God's sake. I find hidden things in objects every single day. This is no big deal.
So I do have a question here from Jeff, and it's, why did Grizzinger hide his documents? What motivated him at the final moment, as it were?
Well, I mean, of course, this is something that I think about a lot, and I reflect on it in great length in the book. Thank you, Jeff. I think it's just worth saying, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it, what the situation was like in Prague in spring 1945, because it was the end of the war and women and children had been evacuated mostly. And there were many German men still left in Prague when the Russians were arriving. And my goodness, that was not a place you wanted to look or sound German at that time. The Germans had been there for 6 years, brutal occupation, absolutely horrific the way the Czech people had suffered for the 6 years during which time Germany controlled the Czech lands. And so by the time we get to spring 1945, there was really a sense among the many Czech people about coming out to take revenge, vengeance against the former occupiers. And so there's all sorts of stories, and I talk about this in the book, about the ways German people in May 1945 were often attacked. They were, many of them, thousands of them were rounded up and taken into camps. And so, you know, there was a real danger of death among the entire German population. So it was in this context, of course, that we lose Grizzinger. He disappears. And it's at this moment that the documents end up inside the armchair.